doesn't make any sense at all.
Everyone's responding to everything. That's all life.
Sure.
No one just acts without you. You didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
That's just a cop-out. That doesn't mean anything.
You're the one providing the cop-out.
This video is from about 6 months ago, but it's about Ukraine and Russia, and I think it's particularly still germane, today as we have a new administration coming in with very different views on Ukraine and Russia. And in this clip, Emily Jashinsky and Ryan Grimm of Breaking Points talk with commentators Vaush and Dave Smith about their views on how this could possibly come to a resolution. It's pretty interesting. I'm only going to do a segment of it here. You can watch the whole video on the Breaking Points channel if you want. I'm going to pepper in my thoughts as we go, and then I'm going to ask for your opinions in the comments, but let's take a listen together.
There's so much dogmatism. And whenever you bring up like modern solutions, people go back to, I don't know, the end of the Cold War. I understand NATO is not exactly a global force for good, but what can we do now? I mean, I so rarely hear answers that are contextualized in the current moment.
Sure. Can I respond to that? Because there's a few that I want to answer your question at the end there, but just like a few things I want to point out. Number one, I think this is almost like bigger than just any political debate. It's a broader theme in life in general. I think anybody who's married, who's on the show or listening to the show knows this is true in personal relationships. There's a tendency to, if you're in an argument with your wife or your husband or something like that, to focus on what they did and what they did that's bothering you. But a much more healthy posture, if you're in a successful relationship, is that you also add in like, okay, well, what am I doing? How am I participating in this? What have I done that's kind of led to this situation? Generally speaking, I think that if you look at the corporate media, you're going to hear all of this talk about what Putin's done. And I think a lot of times in these debates, people can kind of claim to be like, well, I have a more nuanced position. I'm not simplifying things. I think the point of saying that, like, well, all governments are expansionist by nature, so there's no difference between the neoconservatives and, say, other groups of people. I'm not saying they're the same, but like a logical analogy, it's like, oh, well, all governments kill people. So like what Adolf Hitler's doing is just kind of the same as other governments. It's not exactly true. It's kind of different in scale and in kind. To sit here and say, and look, if we have time, we could go through the history of Chechnya and Georgia and all this stuff. But to zoom out a little bit, during the Cold War, we drew the line at the Elbe River, halfway through Germany. On one side was the Soviet Union, and on the other side was NATO. And we're now talking about Ukraine, and you could sit here with a straight face and say, Putin is expansionist. Okay. I mean, if that's how you want to look at it, it's like, let's just look at the actual reality of what's happening here. It's not that Putin has been this expansionist force. Putin has been almost at every turn reacting to the expansion of the American empire.
You got to give him agency, man.
Ukraine. That's just not true. It's not denying someone agency to say that they're responding to something. That doesn't make any sense at all.
Everyone's responding to everything. That's all life.
Sure.
No one just acts without. You didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
That's just a cop-out. That doesn't mean anything.
You're the one providing the cop-out. You're saying that like it's not possible for Putin to have like a distinctly expansionist element to his rule because everyone's just responding to. So do you believe Putin has a distinctly expansionist element to his rule?
Okay, no, that's not a binary. One is, it's not possible.
Wait, do you think he does or doesn't?
Hold on. So instead of just interrupting me, let me make the point. You just laid out a binary between, is it possible he has expansionist intentions, and does he have expansionist intentions? That's not a binary. There are some expansionist desires that he has. No, in fact, if you actually educate yourself on this topic, it was our CIA director who said in the Niet Means Niet memo leaked by Julian Assange that verbatim, this was a choice that Vladimir Putin did not want to have to make. This was a choice that Russia did not want to get involved in this war.
And yet he made the choice. He made the choice to invade, to bring troops down to the Ukrainian border, to commit to multiple years of, like, come on, this is the thing. I ask you for, like, what can we do now? And immediately it's back to the Iron Curtain.
Well, hold on.
I know.
Vash, hold on. Here's what happened. I'm sorry.
I just want to know in the modern context.
I get it. Actually, what happened was you made a long statement and ended with that question. And I said, let me answer that question. But first, let me deal with what you said at the beginning of your statement. And then you started interrupting me. So no, it's not that I'm not willing to answer that question. It's that I had to point out, I think, a lot of the errors that you're making. Now, if you want just to say, what could we do right now? Well, look, we're going to have to be realists about this situation and admit that Ukraine is losing this war and that they're not going to drive Russia out of Crimea. That's a joke. They're not going to drive Russia out of many of the territories that they've taken right now. We should be working toward a deal, a peaceful solution, which has been on the table several times throughout this war, and it's been the West who has been trying to squash it.
Well, that's
what we should do.
Not true at all, though. You've seen, I assume you've read the deals that Putin has put through. Zelensky hasn't been particularly amenable to them himself. The narrative that the West is squashing the peace deals, which is blown up largely because of that one Boris Johnson visit early on in the conflict. Don't get me wrong, okay? The West has its own interests. There are plenty of Western leaders who would like to see the Russian armories depleted. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine would have been jumping at the bit for any of the deals Putin's been offering since the war began. And Ukraine hasn't been losing. Both countries have been stalling. This has been like a slog, and it has been since the first, after the first 3 months of the war. I don't like the narrative that Ukraine's losing, because the fact that they exist at all at this point, considering the Russian armaments aligned against them, is pretty impressive.
That is pretty impressive, actually. I mean, Ukraine has been fighting like hell, and if we had authorized I understand the argument that we don't want to escalate and get into World War III. I do, that there is some water to that argument, but if Ukraine had been able to take the munitions that Europe and the United States have been given and use them in a more offensive capacity, I think that the shape of this war would even be more drastic.
They're pulling guys off the streets to fight.
Oh, yeah, but and Russia has their penal colony forces with the Wagner group pulling from their multiple rounds of really unpopular conscriptions, waves of immigration out of Russia. No, of course not. I'm not arguing that it's a matter of our investment or whether or not it's moral. War makes, unfortunately, unethical decision-making of every side, including the good ones. The Allies did plenty of bad stuff during World War II. I'm only saying that it's been a slog for both sides. I don't want to see this out in I don't want this conflict to end in a way that's going to guarantee the conflict reemerges in 2 years. If you end up just setting the border right where the fighting lines are right now, we're going to be exactly where we were back in 2014. We're going to have a combination of paid separatists and Russian soldiers moving around in the Donbass. There's going to be constant exchanges of fire across the border. This needs a real international solution. I don't know whether that means a proper DMZ. I don't know whether that means genuine reconciliation. Ideally for me, it would be some kind of Hail Mary where Ukraine gets its borders back and there's a massive coming together between Russia and the West, and we reopen trade and negotiations. But that's a little bit of a pipe dream.
Well, it's a lot of a pipe dream. I can't imagine what we could offer Putin to have him entertain that.
We do agree that, at least let's agree on this. If the line just freezes where it is right now, are we not guaranteeing another conflict in a few years?
I don't know that that's possible to say, to be honest.
People be pretty mad. People be firing across the border.
It's not guaranteeing it. I don't know.
Ukrainians, especially at the front, are not positively disposed to each other. I feel like we need to give them something solid, a solid peace. Not just we've decided now the slog has gone on for too long. They'd be throwing rocks at each other across the border, You could get a 5-mile wide DMZ and they'd still be sending drones over with bricks to drop at each other's heads.
Maybe this is all.
It'd be rough.
With the case of in general, with all of the war hawks, everybody who's supported every single war over the last 20 years, it always kind of relies on this unfalsifiable counterfactual, if we didn't do this, then Vladimir Putin would be invading Poland right now, or if the lines were drawn where they are, they'd be throwing rocks at each other or something. It's very hard to say. I think the one thing that I think it's again, to rely on a counterfactual, if that's what we're doing, I think the truth is that there were a lot of much better options. There were off-ramps all throughout the path to get here. And the truth is that if you want to go back to 2014, the West should not have gotten involved the way that it did. That it was such a provocation to back the overthrow of a democratically elected government. All you have to do is think to yourself and just be honest here.
We're in the past.
Well, hold on. Let me just finish my point. If Russia or China had backed the overthrow of the government in Mexico or Canada because they opted to sign a trade deal with us rather than the one that they wanted them to sign, what do you think DC would do? And we all know the answer to that. They'd overthrow that government in a second. And we have a Monroe Doctrine for a reason. And you can say that it's like some relic of the past that faraway superpowers ought not intervene in the region of other large nations, but we certainly wouldn't feel that way. We wouldn't think it was a relic of the past if anybody tried to come over here and set up a military alliance with Mexico or with Canada. Tell me how much DC would go, oh yes, the Monroe Doctrine is just a relic of the past.
Do you think the Bay of Pigs invasion was justified?
No.
Because the Soviets invested economically and militarily into a country that is just off our coast during a time of heightened international conflict. They knew that it would antagonize us. We already had strained relationship with Castro, even though we didn't initially, of course, because we recognized that he was a much better leader for the Cuban people than the man he replaced. Do you not think the Soviets antagonized us in a way much comparable to what we have done with NATO and Ukraine?
Yes, again,
Oh, they did. Okay. So do you think then following the Bay of Pigs? Wait. This isn't a gotcha. This is a gotcha. I think it's an interesting question because I do think the Soviets were a little bit wacky with how they handled Cuba. But I feel like in retrospect, we don't talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion as an inevitable consequence of expansionist Soviet investment in spite of our national interest. We think about it as like Kennedy's mistake,
Right. Okay. But see, a lot of the reason why we think of it as Kennedy's mistake is the logistics of it. By the way, if you really want to get into it, it wasn't Kennedy's mistake as much as it was the CIA's.
The previous administration.
But regardless of any of that, see, what you asked me is if I thought the Bay of Pigs was justified. And I would also say that, no, I don't think Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was justified. Do I think that the Soviets and the Cubans were taking a provocative stance against the United States of America? Of course. Did those provocations lead to the Bay of Pigs? I think that's undeniable. And the truth is that from Vladimir Putin's got a much stronger case about the provocations of the United States of America because it's not just one little island or one economic deal. It's been a steady push eastward since the late 90s.
But now that we are where we are, go right ahead.
Before we go too far, I just want to stand up for the dignity of the Cuban Revolution for just a moment.
Please.
Least surprising development.
It was not a Soviet project. This was an organic Cuban project against the corrupt elites in Cuba. Fidel Castro, in the beginning, thought he could maintain some decent relations with the United States. It was Che Guevara who witnessed in 1954. He was in Guatemala when the U.S. overthrew Arbenz, and he was the one always saying to Fidel Castro, "You're not going to be able to work with the Yankees. It's not possible." Castro wanted to. He was like, "Look, no, these guys are corrupt. I'm George Washington here." It was only when it became impossible for the Cubans to work, for the Cuban revolutionaries to work with the U.S., that they went in the Soviet direction.
And in fact, Ryan,
doesn't make it just, but go ahead, Dave.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong.
Allies.
Correct.
I'm going to stop here because it does go on. This is an over an hour conversation that I think is fascinating. If you're interested in history and the history of all the things they're discussing here, it's worth checking out. Go to the Breaking Points channel on YouTube and check that out. The show is called Counterpoints with Emily and Ryan, and I think they're great. It's heady, it's dense. I am not a historian, but I always learn something from listening to these conversations. Anyway, it does highlight the complexity of international politics, and I think that it comes down to where we see ourselves as Americans on the world stage. We do have the most powerful and expensive military in the world, by far. And I've always wondered what this isolationist worldview is going to do with the military, because nobody is suggesting, nobody is thinking that the Trump administration is going to cut, they're going to try and get out woke generals and everything, but they're not going to dial back on military spending, right? Because that's actually, there's a lot of corruption involved with that too. And yet, how does that square with our isolation? We don't need that for defense, right? I mean, it's only that we use it to intervene. Sure, we use it to defend ourselves, but to intervene in international politics around the world. Let me know what you think in the comments.